Most people think World War II soldiers survived on canned meat and army rations. They didn't. Not when the convoys stopped coming. Not when winter lasted 6 months. Not when every farm was burned and every store was empty. In those moments, hunger became the real enemy, the kind that makes you forget who you were before the war started. So they adapted. Russian soldiers peeled wallpaper off destroyed buildings and boiled it into soup. German troops cut pieces from their leather boots and chewed them like meat. American GIs caught rats in trenches and cooked them over tiny fires. But it got worse. Some mixed sawdust with melted snow and called it bread. Others scraped bark off trees and made it into tea. A few discovered that boiled grass could fool your stomach for a few hours. They never spoke about this after the war. They never told their families. But these choices kept them breathing. Today, you'll discover 8 shocking foods that World War II soldiers were forced to eat just to survive one more day. Hit like and subscribe, because real history is much harder to stomach than what they teach in textbooks. Number 8, boiled grass. In war, the body doesn't wait for permission to starve. And when all supplies vanished, no bread, no meat, not even moldy grain, soldiers looked down at the ground itself. Not for cover, for food, grass, wild weeds, dandelion leaves growing through rubble. Anything green that moved with the wind became a question. Can this keep me alive one more day? Boiling wasn't about flavor. It was about survival. In abandoned trenches and shelled-out fields, men gathered fistfuls of field grass roots and all. They washed it when they could. When they couldn't, they boiled it anyway. Bitter, stringy, often full of grit. But it filled space, and space meant fewer hunger cramps. That was enough. Some soldiers added stolen salt from ration kits, trying to kill the taste. Others chewed it raw, gagged, and forced it down. Their bodies rejected it at first. But desperation has a way of training the gut. In one letter recovered near Leningrad, a young private wrote of boiling grass 3 times to dull the bitterness. On the 4th attempt, he said, it stopped tasting like anything. It just became part of the routine wake. Gather, boil, chew. Not because it worked well, because it was all that worked at all. Even the process gave comfort, heating water, watching bubbles rise, pretending for a moment that it was real food cooking. That illusion, however brief, kept the mind sharper than emptiness ever could. And yes, some got sick. But the choice wasn't between sickness and safety. It was between trying or collapsing. It wasn't courage. It was necessity, shaped by leaves and boiling water. One pot of grass, one more night on your feet. If you've heard of other forgotten field meals passed down through family stories, share them below. In war, even weeds became lifelines. Number 7, burnt flour mixed with rainwater. When even crumbs disappeared, soldiers turned to the blackened edges of survival. Not leftovers, just remains. At the bottom of every field pot or scorched pan, there lived a crust flour cooked too long, hardened and stuck. In peacetime, it would be scraped and tossed. In war, it became the foundation of something desperate. Flour was rare. Burnt flour, even more so. And yet, when rations were gone, soldiers learned to hunt it, scraping charred edges with knives, fingernails, anything that could lift a fragment of starch. But they couldn't eat it dry. Their mouths were too parched, and their throats too raw, so they waited for the rain. With helmets turned upright and tin cups lined outside, drops of water became liquid gold. Not to drink, not at first, but to mix. In makeshift bowls, burnt flour and rainwater swirled into a dark, lumpy paste. It didn't smell like food. It didn't look like anything meant for humans. But it gave the illusion of substance. And sometimes, that illusion kept the mind anchored. They stirred with rusted spoons or carved sticks, creating a slurry that slid rather than chewed. The taste? Smoky, bitter, sometimes metallic. But it filled the stomach, and when your ribs felt like knives inside your own skin, that was enough. One German infantryman trapped outside Stalingrad wrote of boiling this paste 3 times each time trying to soften the burn and kill the taste. He called it ash porridge. Said it reminded him of the bread crusts he used to avoid as a boy. Now, he would have traded a day of life for just one. Others didn't even boil it. They swallowed it cold, straight from helmet lids, washing it down with melted snow or tears. It was never a meal. It was never meant to be. But it was warmth in the stomach where there had been only pain. That's what survival looked like in its rawest form. Burnt scraps, rainwater, and hope stirred together. One bitter paste. One less hour of hunger. If your family ever mentioned ration tricks or makeshift meals from wartime, tell us in the comments. The smallest recipes often carried the heaviest stories. Number 6, raw insects. There's a silence that comes with hunger. A silence so sharp, it drowns out even the sound of gunfire. In the thick jungles of the Pacific, that silence drove men to stare at the ground. Not in fear, but in search. Of movement, of wings, legs, antennae. Because when supplies vanished and the enemy blocked every path to food, nature became the last ration line, and insects were all it had left to offer. They weren't cooked. There was no fire, no time, no second chances. These were desperate grabs. Quick, silent, alive. Grubs squirming under bark. Beetles hiding in rotting wood. Termites crawling across helmets. What once disgusted, now sustained. Some soldiers bit down without chewing, just to avoid the crunch. Others crushed insects first, hoping to forget what they were holding. Many gagged. All swallowed. It wasn't flavor, it was instinct. Instinct sharpened by starvation. Every bite delivered trace amounts of protein, fat, and moisture, exactly what a fading body needed. No salt, no seasoning, just survival. One Marine's letter, recovered years later, described how he memorized which bugs bit back and which ones fed you. He wrote, "The trick is to catch them before they catch you." Another veteran confessed to scooping ant clusters into a pouch, mixing them with leaves, and chewing slowly over an hour just to stretch the illusion of a meal. They didn't write this in field manuals, and no one bragged about it after, because this wasn't pride. This was what came after pride, where men didn't eat because they ate because they still wanted to breathe the next morning. Insects became calories. Calories became time. And sometimes that time was all they had left. It's easy to flinch now, to recoil at the thought. But out there, the difference between collapse and continuation sometimes weighed less than a grasshopper. That's what war does. It rewrites the rules of what's edible, what's acceptable, and what's necessary. One silent bite, one more day in the fight. If your elders ever spoke of jungle meals or survival habits, too strange to believe, drop them in the comments. The war wasn't just fought with weapons. It was survived with whatever moved. Number 5, wild birds and their eggs. They didn't have traps, they didn't have bait, but they had hunger, and that was enough. When rations dried up and animals vanished, soldiers turned their eyes to the trees. Not for shade for movement. Small, fluttering wings. Nests woven high into broken branches. The faint chirp that meant something still had the strength to live. And if it could live, it could be eaten. Wild birds, sparrows, pigeons, crows became targets of desperation. Caught with bare hands, slings made from bootlaces or snapped midair with sheer reflex. It wasn't sport. It was fuel. Soldiers learned to watch shadows, the way a flock shifted, the way feathers scattered when disturbed. They moved without sound, without warning. One strike, one chance, one fragile body that could mean the difference between another hour on foot or collapse. But the real prize wasn't feathers, it was eggs. Hidden under leaves, tucked into brush piles, cradled inside helmet-shaped nests. Eggs meant protein, warmth, and hope packaged in silence. Some were soft-boiled in mess tins. Others were swallowed raw, straight from the shell. No seasoning, no second thoughts. A French soldier once wrote that the first egg he found in 3 weeks made him cry not out of joy, but disbelief. He said it tasted like life pretending it was still possible. Crows and scavengers were the riskiest, tough, bitter, and disease-prone. But that didn't matter. Because when your hands shake from nothingness and your stomach coils in on itself, you stop asking what's safe. You ask what's left. Feathers were burned off with match sparks. Meat was torn, not cut. Bones weren't tossed, they were cracked open for the marrow. Nothing was wasted, not even the silence it took to get close. In those moments, the line between hunter and survivor vanished. All that remained was instinct, sharpened by emptiness. They didn't eat birds because they wanted to. They ate birds because the sky offered what the ground had already taken away. One shell, one heartbeat, one stolen second of strength. If your family carries stories of hunting during war, silent chases, stolen nests, or moments too raw to forget, share them below. History survives in what was eaten and what was never spoken of again. Number 4, wild berries and roots. When supply trucks stopped coming and the map turned meaningless, survival began with the land itself, not with fields. With the places no one thought to look. Bushes hidden beneath ruins, ditches near crater holes, tree lines that hadn't burned yet. That's where the war offered its last fragile mercy, wild berries and roots. Some were sweet, most were bitter. A few could kill you. But soldiers didn't have the luxury of choice, only instinct, passed down or picked up in silence. They didn't eat to enjoy. They ate to gamble. Red berries, dark blue clusters, thorn-covered fruit they learned to test them one at a time. Rub on skin, wait for a sting, bite, then stop. Listen to the body. If it didn't rebel, they swallowed. Roots came from beneath scorched trees, dug out with helmet edges, rinsed in muddy water. Some tasted like dust, others like nothing at all. But even nothing was better than pain twisting through an empty gut. One Canadian scout wrote that the first thing he looked for in any new terrain wasn't cover, it was color. A flash of green, a spot of red, not to hide behind, to chew. And when his friend got sick from the wrong berry, he didn't stop eating them. He just chewed slower. That's how war teaches you hunger. Soldiers began to remember shapes. The root that didn't burn the tongue, the berry that didn't blur the vision. These tiny observations became unwritten rules, shared in mutters, passed like passwords. In the worst days, they boiled root skins in tin cups just to tint the water. They said it tricked the mind into thinking it was tea. Maybe it was, maybe it wasn't. But it helped them sit upright when everything else begged them to lie down. Not every berry saved a life. Some ended one. But in those weeks when nothing else was left, not even courage, those silent, nameless plants, gave enough to keep the eyes open, to take one more step, one stem, one handful, one last try. If your elders ever spoke about foraging, jungle roots, or roadside survival tricks, share it in the comments. Because even in war, nature gave quietly, but just enough. Number 3, rotten fish fermentation pits. Not every meal in war came from the front. Some came from the earth itself, dug, buried, and left to rot. On the island fronts of World War II, where heat soaked the air and flies ruled the trenches, soldiers stumbled across a desperate trick. Not from manuals, not from officers, but from villagers who knew what it meant to survive without stores, fridges, or time. Rotten fish. Buried on purpose. They weren't traps, they were stored. Fresh caught fish, too many to eat in one day, were wrapped in leaves, buried in pits, and left to ferment. Not for days, for weeks. Nature broke them down, softened the flesh, and turned it into something between food and instinct. The smell, overpowering, enough to send a healthy man 2 steps back. But when you hadn't eaten in days, it smelled like the possibility of another tomorrow. Soldiers who learned this method didn't speak of it often. Some were disgusted, others swore by it. Because when fire was too dangerous, when cooking meant revealing your position, these pits became silent kitchens. Fish pulled from the pit were rinsed with rainwater, then eaten cold. Some tried to warm them under sun-heated metal. Others just ate around the softest spots and hoped their stomach could take it. It wasn't just about food, it was about time. A fermentation pit gave you options: you could eat now, or you could have something tomorrow. That kind of control didn't exist often in war. One Marine wrote home about the smell that saved us. He never described it. He didn't need to. His silence said enough. And yes, some men got sick, some pits spoiled, but when jungle rot, fever, and exhaustion were already part of daily life, the risk didn't feel any greater than breathing. They didn't eat it because it was clean. They ate it because it was there, and because it didn't run when they approached. One buried fish, one more day without collapse. If you've ever heard of survival techniques that sound too strange to be real, drop them below. Because sometimes the line between repulsive and life-saving is only a few inches underground. Number 2, trench cake. It didn't look like cake. It didn't taste like it either. But in the mud-soaked trenches of World War II, they called it that anyway because the name made it hurt a little less. Trench cake wasn't baked with sugar or butter. There was no frosting, no sweetness, no celebration behind it. Just scraps. Dry crumbs saved from old bread. Bits of dry potato. Sometimes powdered milk. If someone had stashed it away, they mixed it in helmets, pressed it into mess tins, and if they were lucky enough to light a fire, they baked it. But most of the time, they just chewed it cold, hard, dense, barely edible. Still, they called it cake. Not because it fooled the body, because it helped the mind. It was their way of taking control back from chaos of creating something, however rough, in a place where everything else was crumbling. The recipe changed depending on the front. In colder regions, soldiers added snow to soften the dough. In jungle camps, banana peel fibers sometimes replaced flour. Every version was different. But the reason behind it? Always the same. Something to hold. Something to chew. Something to call your own. One British soldier wrote home describing his trench cake as dry as bone, black as the barrel of my rifle, but better than silence. Another kept his wrapped in cloth for 3 days before eating it, just so he could look at it first. Just so it could remind him of home, even if only for a minute. That's what made trench cake different. It wasn't about nutrition. It was about dignity. Even when hope thinned, when rations vanished, and sleep became a luxury, this heavy little cake became a ritual. A moment of choice in a world that offered none. One handful of crumbs. One pocket-sized act of resistance. If your grandparents ever mentioned recipes made from nothing, flourless cakes, sugarless sweets, share them in the comments. Because sometimes survival tastes like memory, pressed into shape with bare hands. Field bread, they didn't knead it on tables or pull it from ovens. There was no golden crust, no smell to remind you of home. But in the thick of war, they called it bread anyway. Because sometimes giving something a name is the only way to survive it. Field bread wasn't made with wheat or care. It was slapped together from what remained stale crumbs at the bottom of ration sacks, powdered soup thickened with rainwater, mashed roots that didn't poison you last time. Nothing measured, nothing written down. Just memory, desperation, and whatever your hands could hold. In foxholes and bombed-out barns, men mixed this dough with knife tips and helmet lids. Some added wild herbs for taste, if they could find any. Most didn't bother. They shaped it into flat discs or rough balls, pressing them against heated stones or sun-warmed metal to dry them enough to carry, not to enjoy, to endure. It wasn't soft, it wasn't fresh, but it held together. That was the only standard that mattered. One soldier near the Ardennes wrote that his field bread could break teeth, but he kept it anyway. Wrapped it in cloth, stored it in his sock, chewed it over hours like it was gold. Because when your stomach forgets what full feels like, even the toughest bite becomes something sacred. Some carried it in helmet straps. Others tucked it under coats, letting body heat keep it from turning to stone. They'd take small bites, just enough to push off the dizziness, just enough to quiet the shaking. One bite for the morning, one for later. The rest saved for tomorrow, if tomorrow still came. What made it bread wasn't ingredients. It was purpose, Saj. Each piece was shaped not by flour, but by fear. Not baked by fire, but by need. Not a dish, but a decision. Survive, no matter the taste. And still, no one threw it away. Because that crust, that hardened mass of effort, it meant you still had something left in your hands. It meant you hadn't given up yet. One piece of field bread. One more mile walked. If your family ever whispered about war food, field tricks, or the strange things that kept them alive, share those stories. Because survival wasn't always brave. Sometimes it was just baked in silence. Now you know, survival during World War II wasn't about courage in the movies or victories in the headlines. It was about moments no one wanted to remember because they were made of hunger, cold, and decisions that blurred the line between human and animal. These soldiers didn't eat to live well. They ate to live at all. They chewed raw roots, drank rain with ash, buried rotten fish, and called it food. They scraped burnt flour from pans like it was treasure. They made cake from nothing, bread from dust. And when even that was gone, they bit into silence and kept walking. They didn't do it for glory. They did it for the man next to them, for one more step, for one more letter home. And now, decades later, all that remains is the knowledge quiet, nearly forgotten, held in old letters, lost in fading memories, or tucked inside the silence of those who never spoke of what they had to eat just to see another sunrise. But we're bringing that silence back to life. Because remembering isn't about glorifying suffering, it's about honoring those who endured it with nothing but scraps, instinct, and willpower stitched into every ration. So if this story moved something in you, if it made you see your grandfather's hands differently or wonder what your ancestors kept quiet all these years, then do one small thing, like subscribe, share. Not for us, for them. Because every time you carry one of these forgotten lessons forward, you prove they didn't suffer in vain. You prove someone's still listening.